In the last video, we talked about how the establishment was essentially enfranchised into the Constitution, basically making it was a deliberate inclusion rather than something accidental. And then we spoke of the Jacksonian Revolution, which altered the course of the establishment for the next couple of generations. At the same time, it had made the establishment a little bit unwieldy to where it could not deal with change, which brings us to the Civil War. And the Civil War, of course, is the ultimate schism in the establishment. The period is pretty complicated, so we're not going to get into the Civil War itself. But if we take it to its most simplistic terms, we can look at what the Civil War brought. First, it demolished Madison's competing interests because states stopped thinking in local terms and looked to nationwide affiliations. The alteration of the federal system necessitated that states rethink how they do things in order to secure itself against the stronger central government. Second, it increased the voter pool of eligible freemen. Finally, it destroyed the militia system, which would make political parties more important as social and power organization centers. Recall that we were talking about how the militia system was part of an adjunct organization to the political structure where politicians could organize people. So the end of the militia system created a hole for what one might call the gun culture. This led to the founding of the NRA by Union officers. It was modeled after a British counterpart, which incorporated as an adjunct to the British establishment. The American NRA was very similar. It was meant to be an adjunct, and it was meant to weld the gun culture to the establishment. The new American NRA very rapidly found partners in the newly created National Guards that had replaced the militias, as well as the U.S. Army. A pretty sure sign that this was a sanctioned organization and not a grassroots effort. The organization was well funded and spread quickly. The goal was to improve marksmanship for competition and lobby on behalf of gun control. Yes, you heard me correctly. Lobby on behalf of gun control. The NRA favored the 1934 Gun Control Act and actually helped write the 1968 Gun Control Act. This organization has another role to play later, as you may guess. The next big change to the establishment comes from the progressive movement. Progressivism sees liberalism as too slow and disorganized. Progressives model themselves on slavery in the Civil War. Essentially, they look at it in terms that all problems can be solved if credentialed individuals are given the authority to solve it, and whatever force of government required to make it happen becomes available. They favor highly flexible interpretations of the Constitution and law. A study of their success is critical, as progressives are still the dominant philosophy of the establishment today. Understanding how they did this will help you understand how to alter and undermine the establishment. In Minecraft, progressivism is a parallel philosophy to the social gospel. Uh, this was a religious teaching that demanded that society via government organize to eliminate problems, as opposed to the work of individuals or private organizations. For example, government welfare should be favored over private charity. Social gospel spread into the colleges, which still required a fair amount of theology for a degree at that time. Thus, progressivism would contaminate the colleges would produce the next generation of politicians and clergymen. Jackson increased the voter base to dilute establishment power. Progressives decided they needed to control the voters by controlling the political parties. At the same time, progressives would move from the colleges into journalism, creating the idea of muckraking. Muckraking uh, is a concept where you write lurid and often fictional exposés of some horror going on in society. These exposés were essentially the clickbait of their era. All papers wanted to print muckraking stories to drive readership, and this would begin a process of altering journalism from reporting and being the mouthpieces of political parties to being advocates for change. The stories were so shocking that it would cause the readers to demand government action. A famous example of this is communist Upton Sinclair, who wrote the book The Jungle. Now, mind you, this wasn't his intent, it's just the lurid part of it that caused the most action. Part of the book details truly horrific scenes about the meatpacking industry of the United States. Reader outrage would cause the creation of the FDA in leaps and jumps. It wasn't direct, but it basically laid the foundation. Now, Sinclair never spent a minute in a meatpacking plant, nor did he interview workers for details. Progressives also moved to take control of the federal bureaucracy. The progressives used the newspapers to overstate corruption that occurred from the Jacksonian spoils system. Their solution was to test individuals so that it increased the likelihood of the federal workforce being filled with indoctrinated youth from the universities, while at the same time making it almost impossible to fire someone for being disloyal to the politicians. This ushered in the civil service system. Progressive move to control the parties was to push to replace caucuses with primaries. In caucuses, one wins by traveling to the die-hard party volunteers and convincing them to organize for you at the caucus. This creates symbiotic dependency and also tends to pick candidates with a smaller cadre of people who are more educated, motivated, and vested than the rest of the general public. Primaries open up the process to everyone. A primary is won when muckraking newspapers lavish praise on their candidate, and then big money pays for the advertising to help the candidate win. The candidate then becomes both shaped by big money and beholden to it at the same time. Another move by progressives was the alcohol prohibition movement. Earlier, I mentioned that one of the critical places of social political meeting in order to organize occurred in churches, Mason lodges, militia meetups, and drinking establishments. At this point, in the late 1800s, the Masonic Lodge system was a shadow of its former self. The militia system had been mostly disbanded, and the social gospel was causing churches to move away from organizing directly. This made drinking establishments critical places for politics. It was very common for bar and saloon owners to be political bosses, especially in the larger towns and city boroughs. The first attempt at prohibition was centered in something called the Anti Saloon Leagues. Yes, the little ladies did want to ban alcohol, but the money backing them was very political. They would strategically attack saloons with bats at critical times. Often the police would stand down. Women's suffrage is also a progressive move. This is detailed in Rothbard's Progressive Era. The belief was that independent Protestant women of the Anglo-Saxon heritage would turn out and vote progressive candidates in, while Catholics and people from continental Europe descent would not allow their wives and daughters to vote in large numbers. Now consider that a movement that began in the late 1860s and early 1870s ended up putting progressive Teddy Roosevelt in as president and would completely dominate the establishment by 1930. And also, if you see a Republican who's uh, essentially in a massive bromance with Teddy Roosevelt, that's your tip off that you're dealing with one of the progressive Republicans. So, in the comments below, what do you know about progressivism? Were you aware that Teddy Roosevelt was one of them? Had you heard of some of these other items in terms of essentially suffrage, prohibition, and other things like that actually being as much a move against uh, the political non establishment as it was attempting to change society? Please smash the like button. And if the YouTube algorithm brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, please consider subscribing. Check out my other titles, get into a lot of different things. And if you know someone who might find this interesting, please share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.